We are privileged to have here tonight two giants in the field of popular culture, whose books really transcend the genre. Books that have educated not only a general audience, but scientists too. These are books that have been translated into dozens of languages and have won countless awards. Books that have changed the way that we think about history, about evolution, and about our species. Professor Jared Diamond, Professor Richard Dawkins, welcome to Merton College. So this is an event in the Humanitas Visiting Professor program, established by George Weidenfeld in both Oxford and Cambridge, now run by the Weidenfeld-Hoffmann Trust. This particular Visiting Professor program is in history of ideas through the generosity of Francis Finlay. Much of Jarrett's work is in this tradition, but so hard is it to categorize, much is also outside of it. If there is a dominant theme, it lies in the attempt to define and harness lessons from very early human history and to bring them to bear on the problems of our age. Indeed, in his book, Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Survive, Jarrett went on record as saying that his latter work was primarily motivated by a concern for the seriousness of the questions confronting humanity. And so it was. I'm particularly impressed with his earlier book, Why is Sex Fun? And Jarrett is renowned for his fieldwork. If that's not a serious question, I don't know what is.
Humble apologies.
Detracting from my jokes. And so to the question of why Europe became the dominant civilization of the modern period in guns, germs, and steel, and what we can learn from what he calls traditional societies in the world until yesterday. Whether it is sex, power, risk, danger, or religion, we learn from Jarrett how to think of them in new ways. Richard Dawkins, in this city, needs no introduction, but I'll give him one anyway. In his books, The Selfish Gene, and later The Extended Phenotype, he educated not just the layman, but in the introduction of his concept of memes and his argument to show how the phenotypic effect of a gene may not be limited to the body, but extends into the environment as well, he broke new ground in evolutionary thinking. But it is because of his later books, The Blind Watchmaker and The God Delusion, that he is with us tonight. Like Jarrett's recent books, they can be read as responses to a perceived problem confronting humanity. The use, in Richard's view, wholly irrational, of religious belief and religious tradition in framing our situation and guiding our choices. This perspective, I am guessing, may be shared by Jarrett, but he, and I think Richard as well, will be impressed by the limitations of this analysis. For religion, it appears, has played an important role in every society of which we have knowledge. Why? Of course, both may take David Hume's standpoint, conclude that the greater part of what we do and what we believe is grounded not on rational judgment, but on something else, habituation for Hume. Humankind not as Homo sapiens, but Homo habitus. What is that something else in the case of religion? But I hesitate to circumscribe our topic tonight even in these broad terms. The concept, the experience, the practice, the tradition, the history, and the tenets of religion are too wide-ranging for that. Ladies and gentlemen, can we welcome our speakers, Jared Diamond and Richard Dawkins. So a word on the format. So Jared is going to begin, is in effect a talk. Richard will then respond, and then we'll throw the debate over to the audience. Thank you, Jared.
Let me first check whether you can hear my voice in that. It's a great pleasure for me to be back in the UK and to be back at Oxford. I first came to the UK in 1950 when I was 12 years old, brought here by my parents, my physician father, my mother with my sister. It was a memorable visit. It was my first time out of the United States. I remember being impressed by the small size of your cars and your railway cars. I was impressed by your driving, of course, on the wrong side of the street. I was impressed by the fact that there were still dietary restrictions. At the University Arms Hotel in Cambridge, my sister and I were both offered eggs. We did not want eggs for breakfast, and the waiter was astonished and that we would decline eggs, and he said, "You don't understand. Today you are being offered eggs," but I did not want the eggs. So that was my first visit. I then came back 58 to 62 and lived in the UK for 4 years at Cambridge, but traveling around a great deal, including to Oxford. One of my goals was to visit all 26 of the medieval cathedrals of England, and I believe I got through most of them. I then returned again for a sabbatical in Edinburgh in the early 1970s. I've been coming back frequently ever since. This visit is a wonderful opportunity for me because my friends in Cambridge from 1958 from Part 2 Physiology, I've stayed in touch with them. They've remained among the closest friends of my life. And so tomorrow I'll go down to London. I will have lunch with my Cambridge clarinetist. I will have dinner with my Cambridge violinist girlfriend. I will have lunch and dinner with a couple of my Part 2 Physiology colleagues. An added benefit is that there's a fiction that speakers like myself who come are bringing something to the institution to which they come. Namely, there's a fiction that Simon invited me here in order to offer something to Oxford. But Simon and Natalia know very well from looking at my schedule that instead Oxford has been offering an enormous amount to me. Beginning on the day of my arrival, I've had meetings at 45-minute intervals with a list of Oxford people whom I selected as being the most interesting people relevant to work on my next book. Some of you have seen me diligently writing notes. I'll have hours and hours of tapes that I will dictate on the wisdom that I've gained. So I've learned a lot from the visit here, and I've enjoyed the visit here a great deal. I'm happy to continue the fiction that I'm offering something in return for all this. It's also an extra pleasure to be able to appear together with Richard. Richard and I have known each other for some 20 years. We organized together the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory Centennial Symposium at a time when we had not met in person, but it turned out, even at a distance, that we were very compatible. We put together what I think was a wonderful meeting, and we've stayed in touch ever since then. So it's a pleasure to be at Oxford, to be with Richard, to be back in the UK. This evening, I'd like to talk about a subject of much current interest and some controversy, namely the relation between science and religion. Basic to religion is a presumed distinction between humans and so-called animals, and a presumed uniqueness of humans in the universe. But science is just our body of knowledge about the reality of the universe as best we can understand it. So what does science have to say about the foundations of religion in reality? There are two areas of science that are particularly relevant to understanding religion. One is evolutionary biology, and the other is advances in astronomy, particularly within the last 20 years. So let's start with evolutionary biology. We've had compelling evidence for more than a century that our modern human species gradually evolved from now extinct species that anyone would agree were animals. So you can't make a sharp distinction. You can't make a distinction between humans and animals. Instead, the human evolutionary line separated from the line leading to modern gorillas about 7 million years ago. It's separated from the line leading to modern chimps about 6 million years ago. and gradually over the last 6 or 7 million years, various species of the human evolutionary line evolved to be more similar to us modern humans and less dismissible as animals, but there was never a sharp break in time. For most of those last 6 million years, there has always been multiple coexisting human species, some more hominoid species, some more like us modern humans and some more like so-called animals, if you want to make that distinction. It's only in the last 32,000 years, since the extinction of the Neanderthals, that the human evolutionary line has been reduced to just one species, namely us. And there have also always been geographic variation with the human species, within human species plural, just as within most other animal species. So at any given time during the emergence of modern Homo sapiens, that is us, particularly in the last 70,000 years, there were populations more like us moderns and other populations less like us moderns and more like animals. We also now know that our species hybridized recently with at least 2 other human species, namely the Neanderthals and the Denisovians. Most of us, nearly all of us here in this room, are about 3% Neanderthal in our genes. But while our hybridization with the Neanderthals was taking place until 32,000 years ago, there would have been first generation hybrids that were 50% Neanderthal in their genes, and second generation back crosses of those hybrids with Neanderthals who were 75% Neanderthal in their genes, and second generation back crosses of the hybrids with Homo sapiens who were 25% Neanderthal in their genes, and then subsequent generations that were 12% and 6%, finally getting to people like us, humans like us in the 5th generation, 3% Neanderthal in their genes like us humans. So what do all these facts mean about religion's supposed distinction between humans and animals? It's clear that there isn't a sharp distinction. There's variation in time and in space, and religions haven't incorporated that fact. If there was a God that created humans in his or her or its image as distinct from animals, when and where did that God draw an arbitrary sharp distinction between so-called humans and so-called animals? Did we get considered as uniquely human when we became just 25% Neanderthal in our genes, or 12%, or 6%, or did we have to get all the way to 3% to be considered not animals but humans? If we modern humans get judged and sent to heaven or hell, when and where did we start to get judged? Do chimpanzees get judged? Probably not. Did Homo erectus get judged? Probably not. Did 50% and 25% Neanderthals not get judged, while 12% Neanderthals did get judged like us here, who were 3% Neanderthals? Or was there some special 50% heaven reserved for 50% Neanderthals? If a male chimp today dies in the course of killing chimpanzees belonging to another chimpanzee band, does that chimp get rewarded by going to a heaven where it gets greeted by lots of virgin female chimps? Or do only Homo sapiens, who are less than 12% Neanderthal in their genes, get that privilege? I mention these as examples of the problems that the fact of biological evolution causes for a worldview based on a presumed sharp distinction between humans and animals. There isn't a sharp distinction between humans and animals. I'm not claiming that these problems are insuperable for those who believe in religion, but they have to be taken seriously, and as far as I know, they have not yet been taken seriously. The other area of science with consequences for religion is astronomy, and specifically the relatively new subfield of astronomy concerned with extrasolar planets, that's to say planets orbiting other stars. Until recently, we couldn't observe any planets orbiting other stars. We knew that there are something like 100,000 trillion stars, but we didn't know about planets around them. And we've never been visited by flying saucers. So until about 20 years ago, it's been possible, although very improbable, to assume that the only intelligent life in the universe is us humans here on Earth, because none of the other 30 million species on Earth rival us in intelligence. And we hadn't known of any extrasolar planets that might harbor intelligent life, or even any life at all. But beginning a few decades ago, astronomers did develop methods of detecting planets outside the solar system. And at last count, as of Tuesday, May 10, 2016, astronomers had identified 3,264 planets outside the solar system, of which 100 are about the size of our planet Earth, and about 9 of those planets were considered to lie in what is called the habitable zone of their stars, meaning that they lie at a distance where it's neither too hot nor too cold, so life could evolve. 9 habitable planets out of the total of 3,264 extrasolar planets identified so far is 0.3%, but recently expert astronomers have told me that there's a selection bias, so that really probably 20% of extrasolar planets lie in the habitable zone. Most stars that have been searched for extrasolar planets have proved to have planets. Even if there are just 100,000 trillion stars in the universe, and even if most of them also have planets, of which only 0.3% could support life as we know it, that still means 3,000 trillion planets capable of supporting life. Well, experiments in laboratories suggest that it's really easy, close to inevitable, for a planet in the habitable zone to evolve life if it's got the right chemicals. The famous Miller-Urey experiments showed that if you expose a container with water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen to either electricity or ultraviolet light or heat, and the container has those building blocks of water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen, then in the container there will emerge the building blocks of Earth biology, including amino acids, sugars, nucleotide bases, and porphyrins. And so it's likely that the universe contains some trillions of planets supporting life. Probably some of those planets have only living creatures less intelligent than less humans, while some of them have living creatures more intelligent than us humans. And that makes it then extremely unlikely that if there is a God, he or she or it would be especially interested in us humans rather than in those trillions of other life forms more intelligent than us. That's another fact that needs to be taken seriously if one wants to reconcile religion with science. Now, one may object, okay, if there are trillions of planets out there with life, some of them more intelligent than us, then why have we not been visited by flying saucers? On reflection, I think it's clear why we haven't been visited by flying saucers with green creatures asking to be taken to our leader. There are 3 reasons: the space distance problem, the target problem, and the lifespan problem. The space distance problem is that the maximum velocity possible for any object is the speed of light, but the chances of a flying saucer, complete with green creatures and enough to keep them alive, achieving the speed of light is low. But even if they could achieve the speed of light, it would take years to get to us even from the nearest star. And so the space distance problem makes it very unlikely that if stars out there, if Proxima Centauri creatures could produce flying saucers, that we would get visited by flying saucers. Problem number 2 is the target problem. Okay, suppose that Proxima Centauri has intelligent creatures with flying saucers. It's not the case that Earth is the only target to which they will direct all their flying saucers. Flying saucers are going to be expensive resources. You're not going to be able to send out many of them. And there are trillions of potential planets, stars and potential planets around in the universe. So the chances are extremely low that some of those few flying saucers are going to aim at our planet Earth. And then the final reason we haven't been visited by flying saucers has to do with the expected lifetime of a civilization capable of sending out flying saucers. Just consider our experience here on Earth. The first radio waves beamed out were in the 1890s. The first Sputnik, not Sputnik, but Sputnik, was sent up in 1957, but Sputnik couldn't get out of the solar system. The first man-made device on its way out of the solar system was something like a decade or so ago. And at the rate that we are going now, by around the year 2050, we will have destroyed our capacity to put up Sputniks or devices going out of the solar system or radio waves, which means that given our experience, any civilization with the capacity to construct flying saucers also has the capacity to destroy itself, and it's all likely to be over in something like a few decades from the time of the first flying saucer, which means that you can't count all of those trillions of planets as potential sources of flying saucers. You have to divide them by something like 10 to the 8th, given the lifespan of several decades out of the 4.5 billion year lifespan of life on planet Earth, to take account of the very tiny window in which a planet with life is capable of sending out flying saucers. All of that, I think, is the reason why, despite those trillions and trillions of planets with intelligent life out there, we've not yet seen flying saucers, and it's also why I'm confident that we'll never see flying saucers. The fact remains that every human society of which we have knowledge has had something called religion and has believed in a religion with a God with special interest in us humans. Suppose there were a visitor from the Andromeda Nebula to Earth who had gotten around these three problems that I mentioned. And here comes this visitor from the Andromeda Nebula who has been trained in sociobiology in the University of Andromeda and has been trained in psychology and archaeology and knows how to ask the right questions. The Andromedan on visiting Earth would discover that all human societies have something called religion and believe that there's a God with a unique interest in the human species rather than in the trillions of other species out there. The Andromedan would consider that as an obvious fantasy that is not to be believed, but is certainly worthy of investigation. And the Andromedan would note that human societies invest an enormous amount in religion. Hopi Indians, about 1 out of every 3 of them, 1 out of every 3 of their days are devoted to religion. Tibetans, about 1 out of every 4 traditional Tibetans were monks. Just consider Europe, Christian Europe during the Middle Ages, the fraction of resources of Christian Europe that went into religion. It's an enormous expenditure of energy and resources and of people. If all that didn't bring benefits, then any atheistic society that had arisen by chance would easily outcompete all those other societies wasting 1/3 to 1/4 of their resources on religion. So the Andromedan would conclude, as a good sociobiologist, that religion must be bringing big benefits that allows all those religious societies to outcompete any incipient atheistic society. What might those benefits be? The Andromedan would also realize that religion was probably not something designed on purpose by some smart person. For example, it was probably not the case that some pharaoh decided that if he could invent religion, it would motivate all his minions to build pyramids and then to obey the pharaoh. It's probably not intentional like that. Instead, religion, like so many other things, was probably a byproduct of other human attributes. So of what human attributes might religion be a byproduct? The most likely explanation is that religion is a byproduct of our enlarged brain that we use to deduce cause, effect, and agency. For example, the most complex animal language that we know is of vervet monkeys in East Africa. Vervets have separate grunts, separate words that mean, in effect, python, eagle, and leopard. So vervets are smart. But vervets are not smart enough to possess a sense of agency. If there's the track of a python in the grass, if vervets see a python, they shout out the grunt that means python. But if they see the track of a python in the grass, they're not smart enough to infer agency and to realize that that track means the proximity of a python. We humans, with our enlarged brain, are very good at inferring agency. with our ability to infer agency, we can look at other people, and from the expression on their faces, we can infer what they're probably thinking and what they are likely to do to us. We regard other humans as agents like ourselves. We recognize that animals have agency. For example, the Kung hunter-gatherers of southern Africa traditionally made part of their living by finding lions that had killed a prey animal, and then they would drive the lion off the carcass, which sounds suicidal, but Kung are smart enough to have agency. They look at lions whose bellies are bulging, and if they see lions with bulging bellies, they infer agency. They infer that those lions are well fed and are not going to stand at the carcass and will be willing to be driven off. So we humans have an understanding of agency. We attribute agency to other humans and to animals, and that is, of course, is the main secret of our success as a species. In inferring agency, we today would say that traditional humans overgeneralize. Traditional humans apply agency, attribute agency not just to humans and animals, but they also attribute agency to the sun and the rocks. And so they overgeneralize and say that the sun is an agent that moves across the sky, and rivers are agents. Well, today we make a distinction between what we call the supernatural and the scientific. And we say that those overgeneralizations of agencies by traditional people are supernatural, and what we have of agency is scientific. But the distinction is arbitrary, and it depends upon progress in science. For example, in New Guinea, there was a case where a New Guinean who believed that infectious diseases, what we call infectious diseases, were attributable to sorcerers. Along came a medical doctor in New Guinea who said, no, the diseases are not due to sorcerers. They're due to tiny things called germs that are much too tiny to see. And the New Guinean said to the doctor, well, have you ever seen a germ? And the doctor said, no, I've never seen a germ, but I believe in germs. And the New Guinean's response was, well, you're believing in the supernatural, whereas I've got the scientific explanation in terms of sorcerers. So this just illustrates then that the human attribution of agency lends itself to overgeneralization, and that human agency was used to provide explanations for natural phenomena that now we attribute to science, but in the past were attributed to supernatural causes, including gods, including the god Apollo carrying the sun across the sky, whereas now we have so-called scientific explanations for the sun going across the sky. Explanation then was probably a first function of religion, and the usefulness of religion and explanation has decreased over the last tens of thousands of years as science has taken over more and more of the function of explanation. But that surely was one of the first functions of religion, explanation. Another early function of religion has been, and one still persisting today, is to diffuse anxiety over dangers lying beyond our control by resorting to ritual and prayer. Ritual and prayer make us less anxious, and so we are less likely to do something stupid that will cause us to trip and break a leg or get eaten by a lion. Evidence that ritual and prayer really are useful, effective in this way, comes from a recent study in northern Israel in an area that was being bombarded by rockets. In this village in northern Israel, when rockets were coming in from Lebanon, a siren went off and people went into shelters, but the people knew perfectly well that there was absolutely nothing realistically that they could do to prevent the rocket from destroying their houses. And so understandably, people were likely to get anxious and tense and angry. In this particular village, 2/3 of the women, when they heard the rocket siren, went around chanting prayers. And 1/3 of the women were not religious and didn't chant prayers. The study by psychologists of this village showed that the women who chanted prayers were less anxious, less angry, less depressed, better able to sleep. They knew, we would say, those prayers don't reduce the risk that the rocket will blow up your house, but the prayers certainly are effective in making people more content and less likely to do something stupid. That's a function of religion, function related to prayer, that is still with us today. Probably it's decreased because we've taken more control of life, and therefore there are fewer anxieties to worry about, but there are still plenty of people who use this function of religion to diffuse anxiety. Still another function of religion that was probably there early has been to provide comfort, hope, and meaning in life in the face of death and bad things happening. The reality is that bad things happen in life, bad things happen to good people. I recall that when one of my sons was really sick, and we were concerned about the risk of my son dying. The thought of my son dying was unbearable. And while normally I don't believe in heaven, I thought, boy, if I could believe in heaven, and if I could believe that when my son dies, I will see him someday in heaven, that there is a heaven, I found that thought potentially comforting, and that's the closest I've come to believing in heaven. Well, religion provides comfort for bad things happening. It says that there's a heaven there where everything will be made right. Yes, bad things happen to you now, and sometimes bad people get the best of you, but it will all be made up afterwards in heaven. And in fact, there's in heaven there will be both rewards and punishment. So those bad people who did bad things to you now, you're helpless, but they will get it coming to them in heaven. This is a function of religion, providing comfort, that has probably increased as life realistically has gotten harder and crueler since the rise of agriculture and since the rise of the Industrial Revolution. Then other new functions of religion, another new function that would have arisen something like 5,500 years ago with the rise of the first state governments. In small traditional societies, there's not a leader, there's not a chief, but in our modern societies, there are chiefs and there are kings and there are prime ministers. And basically we feed, we reward, we pay the salaries of the prime ministers and chiefs. But at every election, the recent American election, American voters ask themselves, what have those incumbents in office done to warrant my voting for them and providing them tax money and food? Should we throw them out? Well, what's the justification for providing food to chiefs? This was a new problem in human evolution that arose with the development of the first chiefdoms, probably something like 7,000 years ago, and the first kings about 5,500 years ago. Every early kingdom and empire that we know of justified obedience to the kings or queens by saying that the king or queen is divine and has a pipeline to the gods. You should provide food to the king or queen, and in return, the king or queen will use the direct line to the god to bring rain and to bring benefits to you. And that's the case of all early kingdoms of which we have knowledge. That's a function of religion that has decreased with time. Today you obey Theresa May, not because you believe that Theresa May and we believe Donald Trump has a close pipeline to the gods, but you obey Theresa May because they're police, and if you don't obey Theresa May in some important respect, you will end up in jail. So that's a function of religion that has gradually decreased with time. Another function of religion that has decreased with time is the issue of getting along with strangers. In traditional small human societies, these small societies with which I work in New Guinea, consisting of a few dozen to a few hundred people, everybody knows everybody, and the rules of conduct are that you behave well to all the people within your clan, within your village, and you may behave differently towards people in another village. But a new problem in human evolution arose as human populations expanded and as one began to get settlements of several thousand people with chiefs. When you get in a settlement of a few hundred people, you know everybody. Once you get in a settlement of several thousand people, there's then a new problem in human evolution that didn't exist until about 6,000 years ago, the problem of getting along with strangers. In New Guinea, the problem of getting along with strangers traditionally didn't exist. The rules about strangers were very simple. you never saw a stranger normally, and if there was a stranger coming to your village, you can be sure that the stranger was there for a bad reason, namely to prepare a raid in your village or to steal your women or steal your pigs. If you were in the jungle and you ran into a stranger, that was absolutely terrifying. Either you tried to kill him or you ran away. But it then became a new problem in human society when we began to encounter strangers for the first time, living in populous chiefdoms with thousands of people. You couldn't kill every stranger that you came across. Here in this room here, before today, the only person in this room that I knew previously was Richard. Everyone else here was a stranger. I can assure you that in the time that I've been at Oxford, I've not attempted to kill any of you, and I've not observed any of you attempting to kill me. But that could never happen in New Guinea. That's to say, once one gets populous societies, one has to have rules telling you that you should not freak out at strangers and you should not kill strangers. And those rules are provided by codes of moral conduct, like the Ten Commandments, which say things like thou shalt not kill, including thou shalt not kill not only your brother and clansman, but thou shalt not kill strangers. That then is a new function of religion that would have arisen about 6,000 years ago. And again, that function has decreased with time since then, because the reason why I have not tried to kill Natalia during the last day or so is, number one, I've had no motive that I perceive for doing so, and number two, I know that I would get in deep trouble with the British constabulary if I attempted to kill Natalia. It's not the Ten Commandments that have deterred me from killing her. But that then raises another problem which serves the last function of religion, and that is in the justification of war. Tribal societies, the New Guinea societies where I work, have regular tribal war. And New Guineans traditionally had felt no inhibitions about killing people in the next village, because the rules of conduct were that you are nice to your clansmen in your own village, but those bad people over in the next village, of course you kill them. And there were no inhibitions. New Guinea children were not brought up with a moral code that said thou shalt not kill. Instead, they were brought up with a moral code that said thou shalt not kill the people in your village, but for heaven's sake, do kill those jerks next door. When, however, codes such as the Ten Commandments came in, supposed universal codes that claimed to be universal rules of human conduct, then there was a problem, because if you rear a boy, or in Israel a girl, for 18 years saying thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not kill, and suddenly at 18 you draft them and tell them, forget that, now do kill, and do kill those people over there. The result is, to put it mildly, confusing. You may well know that in the First World War, something like half of the soldiers in the First World War could not bring themselves to fire a gun. My wife, a clinical psychologist, works with soldiers in Southern California, so we know how the U.S. Army trains soldiers to kill and overcome their inhibitions. Our soldiers are put out in the U.S. desert, and they're given big targets that are not at all human, and they're told to shoot, and gradually the targets are made more and more human, and gradually the targets are converted into targets that show a picture of an actual human, to train soldiers to overcome their inhibitions. During the Second World War, Japanese soldiers were trained how to kill by being presented with tied up Chinese prisoners and then being told to bayonet the Chinese prisoners and learn to overcome their own inhibitions about not killing. So the rule about thou shalt not kill, how then does one justify, in modern times, killing other people? And the solution until relatively recently was to say, though the Ten Commandments apply to your own group, but believers in another religion are despicable and deserve to be killed, and so you have a positive obligation to go kill people belonging to another religion. During the Middle Ages in Europe, there was, of course, mass killing justified by religion. That's a new function of religion. That's another and that function of religion has probably been around for several thousand of years. that function of religion is non-existent in New Guinea. Not once in all the stories that I've heard from New Guineans about the tribal massacres in which they participated have I heard any hint of religious motivation. One goes kill the people next door, of course, because those people next door deserve to be killed, and there's nothing about their having a different religion, no religious motivation. That's a function of religion that has decreased in the last 1,000 years. In the recent world wars, most killings were motivated by political reasons rather than religious reasons. But it still is the case today that there are plenty of people in the world today who are motivated to kill for religious reasons. So those are what I see as functions of religion. Those are the reasons that have enabled throughout human history religious societies always to outcompete any incipiently atheistic society, despite the big investment of time and energy and manpower and woman power that religion requires. Nevertheless, religious societies have obtained these decisive benefits that have enabled them to outcompete atheistic societies. And that's why I see religion as having become universal, namely the benefits that it brings. One can still ask, what about the future? Is religion going to be around 50 years from now? My guess would be it is or will not be around 50 years from now, depending upon these benefits that I've mentioned. Some of the benefits are fading, some of the benefits are still around. If it is the case that in rich, peaceful, educated countries today, religion has been decreasing to the point where I'm told that church attendance on the average Sunday in Scandinavia, maybe even in the UK, is less than 10% now. Religion tends to be adopted more in poorer countries in the world. Even within a country, within the United States, which is a rich country, the US is nevertheless heavily religious, but there's a geographic skew in that the most religious groups within the United States are the poorer areas, the people who have more to be dissatisfied and anxious about. And so I would guess that 50 years from now, if the world succeeds in solving its problems and everybody is happy and rich and contented, religion will continue to decline. Whereas if there's a bad outcome and the world gets unhappier and there's more anxiety to be diffused, religion is going to increase. But we shall see. And on that cheerful note, I will sit down and let's hear from Richard.
Well, thank you, Jared. I too feel greatly honoured to have been invited to respond. The first time, or possibly the second time I met Jared, well, I'm reminded of your introduction when you said when you first arrived in Britain you were impressed by how small our cars were. You invited me to lunch in Los Angeles, and we agreed to meet on a certain street corner. And I thought I was waiting for some smooth Lincoln or Cadillac or something like that. And eventually I didn't pay much attention to this little Volkswagen that was chugging along the street, bouncing along with a sort of curtain of roof hanging down from inside. And there was Jared, and we went and had a delightful lunch, which consisted of bread and cheese, hunks cut off with a Swiss Army knife on the campus of UCLA. And it was a most wonderful lunch. We had a wonderful conversation. One of the things that Jared brings to this discussion is, of course, his immense knowledge of tribal cultures in especially New Guinea. And his book, The World Until Yesterday, is much informed by that. I think it might have been the very first time I met Jared. It was at dinner on Long Island, and he told us the story of how a research assistant of his, when doing fieldwork in New Guinea, had asked for permission for leave for the weekend so that he could go home and eat his uncle. Do you remember that? Yes.
Very good.
Right. Now, going through the various points of this fascinating lecture, the first point on astronomy and the likelihood of there being life elsewhere, I think you actually underestimated it when you used the Miller-Urey experiment, because since that experiment was done in the 1950s, we now know that many meteorites actually contain carbon compounds of just the very complex kind that Miller found in his experiment. So in a way you could say Miller didn't even need to do his experiment, because the compounds that he discovered in his flask were already present in the universe, as we know from carbon-containing meteorites. So I would agree with you that the likelihood of there being life elsewhere, and probably much less common intelligent life elsewhere, is very high. On the other hand, I suppose we should apply the anthropic principle a little bit and say, if, which is highly unlikely, we are the only life form in the entire universe, or if there is only one life form in the entire universe, then that life form has to be here, because here we are talking about it. So it is actually possible that we are unique. Nevertheless, I agree with you. In my own intuition, my gut feeling, Carl Sagan was once asked, did he believe in life elsewhere in the universe? And he said he didn't know. So his questioner said, but what is your gut feeling? And Carl Sagan said, well, I try not to think with my gut. Nevertheless, my gut feeling agrees with yours, Jared, that there almost certainly is plenty of life in the universe. I entirely agree with you as to why we've never been actually visited. If we ever are visited, it will not be by physical bodies, it will be by radio waves. And I think the SETI enterprise, which is listening out for radio communication, is worthwhile and worth spending money on. However, I'm not sure what relevance it would have to the question of the existence of a God, because while I share your doubts about the existence of a God, I think a theologian might say that all that your argument disproves is a very shallow, parochial, narrow, small kind of God, the one that cares about human affairs. And I suspect that more sophisticated modern theologians would feel that the sort of grand, magnificent God they believe in would have plenty of time to deal with all those different planets and all those different civilizations. But as I say, I fully agree with your belief on that. On the chain of ancestors, the thing about did God intervene to give a soul to the Neanderthal or to at what point in the evolutionary history did the soul, the immortal soul, get injected? I think you could make a better case. I think once again, a better case could be made not for belief in God, not for religion, but for morality. And I want to, it's like digression from your point, but our morality, our human morality, is deeply speciesist. We dig a great trench around Homo sapiens, and what is moral, what you can do to a Homo sapiens is radically different from what could be done to any other species. The third chimpanzee is protected in a way by our morals and by our ethics, in a way that neither the two species of Pan nor any of the other great apes, or indeed any other species, is protected. You can keep chimpanzees in zoos. The idea of keeping a human in a zoo would, of course, be repugnant to anyone. A human embryo, even a tiny a zygote, a single-celled embryo, is, according to some religions, protected, even regarded as murder if you kill one by some religions, whereas an adult cow is fair game. Now, if you look at that from an evolutionary point of view and recognize that your argument about Neanderthals and Denisovans and so on applies to all species. That if you could imagine a sort of human chain where you hold the hand of your mother, who holds the hand of her mother, who holds the hand of her mother, and go on back through the generations, there will come a time on this chain when you hit a fish. You would be happy to eat your ancestor served up with tartar sauce. And at some point, presumably, our speciesist morality has to draw a line. There is no sensible line to be drawn. And I think you could have made a very strong argument about that, as strong as the argument you made about religion. Maybe I should stop there and see whether you have any response to what I've said so far.
My response to what you've said so far is I think this is the first time that you and I have had a public conversation, and you're well known for your power of thought and expression, and it's absolute delight for me to sit next to you and enjoy your power of thought and expression. So my inclination is for me at this point to shut up and ask you to talk some more.
Well, if you really mean that, maybe I should then move on to your list of reasons why religion persists and arose. The first one was explanation, and that certainly rings bells. I mean, humans are coming to this world amazed, or we should be amazed by what we see, and baffled for an explanation, seeking explanation. And I think it's easy to imagine that we would seek for some kind of supernatural explanation. And you singled out in particular the idea of agency. And I think we can even make a strong Darwinian case here. When you see, well, you mentioned pythons. Suppose that you're in the African savannah and you see a rustling in the long grass. It could be a python or a leopard, or it could just be the wind. And the likelihood is it's just the wind. But on the other hand, if it is a leopard or a python, you're dead. And so there would perhaps be a perfectly good Darwinian reason why natural selection would build into us a tendency to read agency into what actually is just physics, just physical elements. And so that seems to me to be an entirely sensible reason why religion might have arisen. Diffusing anxiety, and you actually gave some evidence that this might have positive benefits. Not just it feels good to diffuse your anxiety, but actually might also have health benefits. I mean, you said your anecdote about the women in Israel who recite psalms when under bombardment. It wasn't just that they feel better about it. You actually implied, I think, that they actually were more healthy as a result of that. And I think there's some evidence that religious belief does, even in our society, religious belief does confer some minor health benefits, presumably working through reduction of stress, since so much of disease is exacerbated by stress. And so that seems to be plausible. The third one was comfort, consolation in the face of death, in the face of death of loved ones, in the face of a desire to find meaning in life. Again, psychologically perfectly plausible. It's sometimes wrongly put to me that this is somehow a justification for a belief in God. It's not a justification for belief in anything. It may comfort you, but that doesn't make it true. As Steven Pinker pointed out, you may console yourself by the thought that the lion chasing you is actually a rabbit. But as a matter of fact, it's a lion. Nevertheless, I can easily see a perfectly good psychological reason why my religion might be comforting. And then the point about chiefs and kings, which, as you said, and I was very interested to learn this because I hadn't known that in tribal societies, hunter-gatherers like the ones you studied, I hadn't known that there was so much, almost, one could almost say democracy, so certainly equalities, a lack of chiefs, a lack of kings. But when chiefs and kings came along, I think you were suggesting that they make use of religion, the pipeline to the gods, as a way of exerting authority over their subjects. Very plausible. That, and I think the remaining ones of your list, all apply to a kind of group advantage, an advantage of religion for the group, for the people, for the tribe, for the nation, as opposed to the kind of Darwinian advantage which has to accrue to the individual, or as I would say, to the gene. And I'll come on to that in a moment. I am interested in the question which you touched on, I think briefly to dismiss, that chiefs and kings might actually design, or priests might actually design religions for the purpose of exercising their authority over their subjects. And it seems to me that your number 4 reason, chiefs and kings one, could be that the chiefs and kings and priests design religion for that purpose, or it could be that it evolves by some less deliberate purpose, and the chiefs and kings take advantage of it, and perhaps we could return to that. The 5th one, getting along with strangers. Again, I think I vaguely knew that if you go for a walk in New Guinea and you meet somebody from the wrong tribe, the first thing you do is try to kill them, or else run away from them. And I think I admire your bravery in doing your field work in these conditions. I'm fascinated by the fact that the New Guinea Highlanders were unknown until, the 1930s? It's an amazing thought. This rich population of, I think, literally thousands of different languages, all existing in this highland area that no one outside had visited. I think that's totally amazing. I'd like to hear much more about that. But again, to speak of religion as serving the function of reducing that danger of tribal killing, that again is a group benefit. It's not the kind of benefit which an orthodox neo-Darwinian like me would warm to. But I'm, we can come back to that. And again, the same with war. Perhaps we could come onto that point, because I know you're sympathetic to David Sloan Wilson's book, Darwin's Cathedral. And Wilson, I expect many people know, is perhaps the leading, D.S. Wilson is perhaps the leading apostle of the group selection theory of evolution, where natural selection works not merely at the level of the individual and the individual's genes, as Wilson himself admits, but also works at the level of the group, such that groups that survive are selected in a Darwinian way as against rival groups that don't survive. And I think it's right to say that several, at least, if not all, several of your advantages of religion are group-level advantages. Some of them are a bit of both. I mean, the one about finding consolation, reduction of stress, reduction of anxiety, that could be regarded as both an individual advantage, and I made the point that people who believe in religion may be less prone to stress-related diseases, so that's an individual level advantage. But at the same time, that and all these other ones could be seen as group-level advantages. So perhaps I could put the question to you, how important do you see group-level advantage as opposed to individual-level advantage in religion?
Sure. I feel like a referee in a fast-moving soccer alias football game, who doesn't want to interrupt the play, but drops flags around the field so that when the play stops, you can come back to the flags and then figure out what happened. So I've been dropping flags
Okay.
as you've been talking about the very interesting points that you've been raising. Let me begin with the discovery of the Eastern Highlands. Now, because it's such a fascinating affair, an emotionally gripping affair, even though it's not directly concerned with the subject of religion. You're correct, Richard, that until 1931, so the island of New Guinea, second largest island in the world, it's about 1,000 miles long and 400 miles across. And the backbone of the island is formed by a mountain range that rises up to 5,000 meters, so it's glaciated. New Guinea, along with Peru and Kilimanjaro, one of the 3 places in the world you get snow on the equator. Europeans attempted to penetrate the interior of New Guinea, particularly to study birds, and the British Ornithologists Union sent a centenary celebration expedition around 1910 to try to get into the mountains in New Guinea, starting from the coast. In the course of 18 months, they got 70 miles inland and had to give up and come back. It is just so difficult to progress in New Guinea because of the terrain, the jungle, the ridges. When I'm making a trail in New Guinea, when I and New Guineans are working our way up a mountain range, a good day is when we make half a mile. A terrific day is when we cover 3 miles. A bad day is when we cover only a couple of 100 yards. The result of all this is that until 1931, Europeans could see from the coast the mountains, and they even saw from the coast the white, so that they knew there were glaciers 100 miles inland, but they hadn't got there until in 1931. A group of miners, the Leahy brothers, Australian miners, prospecting for gold, attempted to enter what was supposedly the uninhabited center of New Guinea. And what they found when they crossed a ridge in the late and looked out, they were astonished to see lights all over the place, campfires all over the place. What was supposed to be the uninhabited center of New Guinea was just dotted with people. And the discovery of the most densely populated valley in western New Guinea, what was then Dutch New Guinea, was carried out by a ornithological expedition, the Archbold expedition from the American Museum of Natural History, flying over in an area that in the center of New Guinea that was thought to be uninhabited. And to their astonishment, as they crossed, they looked down and it looked like Holland. It was a deforested, flat valley, crisscrossed with ridges and with drainage ditches and huts and villages. That was the discovery of about 1 million, 2 million people of whom the world had not known. Of the world's 7,000 languages, 1,000 are confined to New Guinea. As I walk through the highlands of New Guinea, on the average, every 10 miles is a new language. And I love languages, and so love learning languages. And so when I went out to New Guinea for the first time in 1964, the first people that I was with, the Foray, I started to learn Foray, and I was there for a month, and I worked out the case structure and the tenses, and then we drove on another 50 miles. In those 50 miles, I found that I had shot through 6 language groups, and I realized, Jared, you can't learn a new language every month. And so in New Guinea, I learn the names of birds in each language group that I work with, but I have not learned another language after Foray. So it is the case that New Guinea has been the largest first contacts in modern times. That's to say, the largest group of people who had no knowledge, no contact with the outside world, and then were discovered in 1931 and 1938. There still are uncontacted groups, small ones being encountered in the New Guinea lowlands. One of the areas where I'll be working either end of this coming year or the following year, missionaries flying over there have seen a group in an area, karst area, where it's not known that there are any people, and they are probably uncontacted. The Amazon basin, is the other place that has uncontacted people left in the world. But first contact, again, this is all the way away from religion, but I find it so gripping. First contact, I have friends who want to make first contact with people who've never seen the outside world. I never have and never want to make first contact because it's absolutely terrifying. The people that you encounter, they don't know what you're going to do. I don't know what they're going to do. I don't know whether they're going to panic and go for their weapons. In one of my projects, in what I thought was an uninhabited mountain range, I was aware of the possibility that there might be nomads there. For a year before I went out there, every night before I went to sleep in Los Angeles, I thought, what would I do if, God forbid, I should encounter an uncontacted nomad, because it's just so dangerous. And my fantasies were that I would sit down to show that I was non-threatening, that I would make bird songs, that I would take out a biscuit and eat it and hand it to him. But it was all unrealistic. I knew that whatever I did, I was likely to end up killed. So that's first contact. Coming back to religion, Richard, the issue that you raise about individual versus group benefits, the question of group benefits for religion, I would not generalize for it. If there are group benefits from religion, I would not consider that as having a broader significance for the issues about individual or group benefits in evolution in general. But it does seem to me that religion brings, as you say, both individual and group benefits. For those women chanting psalms under rocket attack, it brought individual benefits, and they were considerable individual benefits. They were less angry, they slept more, they were less likely to do something stupid and start running, and as a result fall into a ditch or get hit by a rocket when they should be in a shelter. So that's a considerable individual benefit. As for the group benefits, a religion that can motivate for, let's see if I've got the numbers right, a religion that can motivate 12 people to to take over airplanes and crash the airplanes into 2 towers in the Pentagon, a religion that can motivate 12 people to kill 2013 of the other side. That's a strong group benefit. So I see both individual benefits and group benefits in religion. And then finally, Richard, to come to the first issue that you mentioned about the moral chain, so there's I, and there's my mother, and there's my ancestor, and then we go back to fish, and we can go back beyond fish. Where along the chain does one impose moral standards? That may seem like perhaps a thought experiment pulled out of nowhere, but in fact, the history of the 20th century is lots of those experiments, because the history of the 20th century is the gradual expansion of morality to extend principles of morality to more and more creatures. Until the 19th century, it was acceptable for humans to do things to other humans that are not acceptable today. The New Guinea Highlanders had the good fortune to be discovered in 1931 and in 1938. If they had been discovered in 1873, they would have been pushed off, shot. But when they were discovered in 1931 and 1938, changes in morality were such that it was considered no longer morally acceptable to shoot New Guineans and drive them off their land and take over their land for coffee plantations. So there's been an extension of morality to other groups of people. There's been an extension of morality to other genders. Women now have rights that they did not have a century ago. Women can vote. In most countries, a century ago, women cannot vote. In New Guinea and in traditional societies, the cruelty towards women is unbelievable. That is now considered unacceptable in modern industrial society. And then finally, there's the extension to animals. I have many friends who consider it immoral to eat or to kill an animal. I must say, I don't think of it. I confess that when I take my bird walks on the street, if I come across a snail, I confess that I crush the snail because the snails eat up my wife's garden. But I can imagine that some decades from now, it may be considered morally reprehensible to step on a snail or to step on an ant. So the point that you make about the moral chain, what I see happening recently is an extension of the moral chain to acknowledge moral rights to groups of people and to animals that were not considered as having moral rights. In the United States now, the first chimpanzee that I saw close up was a chimpanzee that was in a small cage at the National Institutes of Health, being injected with the brains of Kuru patients, resulting in the demonstration that Kuru, New Guinea laughing sickness, was a transmittable infectious disease, a prion disease. But that chimpanzee was in a small cage where it couldn't move around. That was 1964. Today, that would be considered unacceptable.
Yes, that's a very shrewd point, and it's one that I think needs to be made when people claim, as they often do, that we need religion to be moral, because the shifting moral zeitgeist that you've been referring to, which shifts over decades, as you said, changing attitudes towards non-human animals, towards slavery. In Tasmania, not that long ago, Aboriginals were hunted for sport. This has changed, nothing to do with religion. This is a shifting moral zeitgeist which has something to do with very complicated factors. I don't know even what they are. There are things like moral philosophers debating. There are things like legal philosophers. There are just journalism, dinner party conversations. All this results in a change in our moral zeitgeist, which owes actually nothing to religion. And so I get very impatient when people try to say, you've got to have religion, otherwise people would be immoral. Now, on the question of group versus individual benefit, I think it's entirely persuasive that religions do confer benefits on societies, as you say. A society that has a religion that can cause people to go to war and kill other societies has benefits from the point of view of group survival of that society. But that's not Darwinian selection. That's, I think, my quarrel with D.S. Wilson is that he talks about that as though it was Darwinian selection. That's much more like ecological replacement. It's much more like, say, the replacement of our British red squirrel by the grey squirrel when it was introduced as a jeu d'esprit by the Duke of Bedford. The grey squirrel has wiped out the red squirrel. That's not Darwinian selection. That's ecological replacement, and that is what you're talking about when you talk about a religion having, shall we say, a warlike god of battles which inspires its soldiers to go to war and kill the enemy, or which gives soldiers courage because they're convinced that if they die a martyr's death, they'll go to a martyr's heaven. So let's go along with D.S. Wilson, and indeed with Darwin, because Darwin made a similar point about tribes having differential survival success because of what they do. Let's go along with that, but let's confuse it with Darwinian selection.
I'm in complete agreement with that, and I believe it's true that I've not used the word Darwinian selection. I don't think I've used the word Darwin this evening. I just note that human groups compete with other human groups, and much of human history consists not of single individuals gaining great advantage, but of human groups gaining advantages over other human groups. This is the history of New Guinea, and one sees it particularly in New Guinea because fighting traditionally was widespread. Groups replaced other groups. They replaced other groups by killing off or driving out the members of the other groups. My New Guinea friends have told me stories of what they did to other groups, and the result was that they acquired the land of the other groups, or they acquired the women of the other groups. I see this as a group advantage of religions or group advantage of religion in modern times. But in New Guinea, it's not driven by religion. It's a group advantage of a culture, of a shared ethos within a tribe that motivates them to go kill the next tribe. And it seems to me that much of human history consists of groups replacing other groups in the way that you say red and gray squirrel replace each other.
Thank you both. This has been a fascinating conversation, but there are other voices in the room. Can I hear some? Yes, gentlemen here.
Thank you very much, Jen, for your very interesting contributions. Really, it's the case that what we term ethical behaviour must ultimately be self-interested human beings. At the very minimum, it has to avoid the line distinction of people who have that ethical view. Really, can we extend ethical behaviour beyond ourselves, beyond our own species, without risking ourselves? Ultimately, therefore, we must ethical behaviour in actual fact always be in some instance self-protection of human beings.
Let's gather a couple more questions to Lindy.
So, thinking about what you said about a function of religion being to explain why bad things happen, and it struck me that often people rely on religion to explain why good things happen. So you know, you often find that people will say, well, bad things happened to you, but I was saved and God saved me. So that you often hear that, you know, that I was saved from the from execution, or I was saved from the storm, or something like that. And so it's there's a sense of God favouring them, and I guess that's to deal with the arbitrariness and the idea of luck in life. So I wondered what you thought of that, and presumably that's really an aspect of your third function, but also diffusing anxiety, and ultimately your first function about explaining why things happen as well.
Can I tell an anecdote related to this? I was doing a television program called Sex, Death and the Meaning of Life. Excuse me. And I was sent to Nairobi to interview a Nairobi prostitute who, as was known from genetic research, was genetically immune to AIDS. And she'd been a prostitute for some 25 years and was still alive. And I asked her, why do you think all your colleagues who joined the profession at the same time as you did are now dead? And she said, oh, well, obviously God must be looking after me. Exactly as you said. So I said, well, why didn't God look after all your friends? And she said, oh, well, I can't answer that, but I will say this. God obviously loves condoms.
So I have another question. I'm not forgetting the ethics and survival. Yes.
You have discussed religion in utilitarian terms, in terms of function. You've discussed religion in utilitarian terms as a function, in terms of sex, in terms of death, in terms of social functions, and being able to reproduce both the individual and society. That's how I interpret it. I was wondering, where do you draw the distinction between religious expression and artistic, poetic, different ways of achieving those same functions? And if so, how would you extract meaning and purpose from art without sort of crushing or displacing or making it difficult to answer those cosmic questions that science would have difficulty answering?
Could I respond to that? I come prepared. We have no, so far we've been talking about religion for nearly an hour, but we have not defined religion. So how does one define religion? And it turns out it is difficult to define religion. How do you differentiate? How do you do distinguish religion from philosophies, from rules of life. This is a real debate. Is Buddhism a religion? My understanding is that the Buddha himself did not claim to be proclaiming a religion, but claimed to be offering a way of life. Is Confucianism a religion? My understanding is that the general view of philosophers now is that Confucianism is not a religion. So how do we define a religion? The problem when one tries to define a religion is that defining it by any single characteristic doesn't work, because any single characteristic that you attribute to religion is absent in some things that everybody would consider religion, and is present in some things that nobody would consider religion. For example, Judaism. Belief in God is not required in Judaism. The rabbi that I know best, when I discussed with him, what do you think, is there a God? He said, maybe, maybe not, I'm not sure. And the fact is that belief in God is not required of Judaism. So when I was writing a chapter on religion in my book, The World Until Yesterday, I knew that I had to define religion. And so here's my definition. Brace yourselves, because this is going to take 55 seconds. But it's, I think, a correct definition of religion. Here we go. Religion is a set of traits distinguishing a human social group sharing those traits from other groups not sharing those traits in identical form. Included among those shared traits is always one or more, often all three, out of three traits, namely supernatural explanation, diffusing anxiety about uncontrollable dangers through ritual, and offering comfort for life's pains and the prospect of death. Religions after early ones became co-opted to promote political obedience, tolerance of strangers belonging to your religion, and justification of wars against groups holding other religions. That's religion.
Religions are the attempt to understand the metaphysics of the universe.
Is that a question?
Do you recognize your intelligence as being metaphysical?
Well, I cop out quickly because I don't understand the word metaphysical, so I'll turn to you.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say.
Well,
It means beyond physics.
yes, well, speaking is the only metaphysician. What was that again?
Expecting to instruct our guest, who might be great special. Metaphysics is actually what organizes physics. You may not believe it exists, but you should recognize that physics has an order. Do you recognize that physics has an order?
Yes, I think physicists generally recognize that physics has an order. So I think we're fine with that. We can agree. But there's a question over there.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the role of religion, or the lack of religion? What do you think their role will be on human response to climate change and the biodiversity crisis that we're facing?
And can we have another question, perhaps? Yes, at the back.
Okay, I'm going to try to be really loud. You guys talked at length about the role of religion in promoting a group's ability to kind of adapt in the and kind of pseudo-evolutionarily, although we talked about that wasn't Darwinian. Do you think that it played a role in some religions becoming dominant while others not becoming dominant, or would you trace that back to, especially your previous work on kind of why, would you say it's just because the society itself became dominant and then the religion became dominant with it, or do certain religions carry characteristics which may allow societies to benefit more than others?
Shall I do the first one? Climate change. The role of religion in alerting us to climate change. It is the role of science to alert us to climate change, and science is attempting to do that. The role of religion could be important insofar as religious leaders have millions of followers who will listen to them. And the present Pope, Pope Francis, has distinguished himself by coming out and alerting his followers, who are extremely numerous, to the dangers of climate change. So although it's actually nothing to do with religion, it does have a lot to do with the chief of a particular religion, in Jared's terms.
I'd add to that that in the United States, when one looks at the involvement of religion in the big ethical and social movements of the United States in the last 40, 50 years, religions were very active in the civil rights movement for racial equality. And religions have played some role, both negative and positive, in the efforts for gender equality. What has been disappointing after the big involvement of American religions in pressing for the civil rights movement has been the relative lack of involvement of American religions in the environmental movement. Sure, the environmental movement is, among other things, it's about the survival of the human species. One would think, surely, if religion is concerned about the survival of the human species, it's a life or death matter for religion to be a major force in the environmental movement. But disappointingly, American religions have not played much of a role in the environmental movement. That's unfortunate. I would like to add one thing in response to a previous comment, and that had to do with the utility of religion. My view of religion would be unashamedly utilitarian. That's to say, if one does not believe that there is a higher being with a special interest in the human species as compared to the likely trillions of other species out there, and one still has to ask, why is it that nevertheless religion is so widespread, nearly universal among human societies? It seems to me the answer has to be a utilitarian one, namely that religion provides utility to these societies, and societies without religion are, if there were any, and they've disappeared so quickly that we don't know about them. If there were any, they got quickly run out by the religious societies, just as the gray and red squirrels, one did the other.
I want to ask a question which I think is going to be sweet channeling what I'm going to thought you were saying, but I'm going to do it to such esteemed guests. I take the utilitarian view very much, and one could call it a functionist view. But what I don't fully understand is why this is so neatly and inevitably and seemingly required to be paired with the evolutionary view. In other words, one doesn't have to accept a belief in God and all the rest of it. One can take a utilitarian position. But it doesn't have to be about out-competing. So I'm thinking specifically of the social scientist of religion, Emil Durkheim at the beginning of the 20th century, who has a definition not so different from your own, and I don't think he would disagree with your definition. It's precisely about the functions that you listed, but the language of competition is not part of that definition. It's simply about social solidarity, so it's not necessarily that you can kill everybody else, it's that you stick together by hook or by crook. One doesn't have to necessarily, I fear, undermine the capacity of culture to do all kinds of things that are not evolutionarily based by focusing on the functions of religion. I don't think that they're the same.
Let's try to go along with to go along with your reasoning, and your reasoning translated into my terms might be that religion brings benefits. It brings benefits to the individuals. Let's leave out the benefits to the groups.
No, well, it's benefit to the group that is useful, but it's because social solidarity is itself a healthy and regenerative thing, but that's not the same as a competitive advantage necessarily.
Then we'll offer two versions of your argument, one of which I think was not the version that you yourself offered. Secondly, that religions might bring benefits to the group, and never mind the issue of competition. But first of all, that religion brings potential benefits to individuals, to any individual, and therefore, since it brings benefits to any individual in any society at any time, one might say that enough is to explain why religion is a human universal.
I wish to just pose a question myself about this definition, Jared. Very interesting one, but it seems to suggest that the ambition of some theists that there be a world religion, or that religion acquire some hegemonic status, is self-defeating. Would you accept that?
Probably yes. The exception would be that if we had a world society that were one group, if the world changed so that there were a single language and we all identified ourselves as belonging to one society, then there might be one religion. But I don't see that happening, even with the mass extinctions of languages going on now. The expectation is by the end of this coming century, there'll be 200 languages left, the world's major languages. And if there are 200 languages, then a substantial fraction of them are going to be associated with separate religions. So I certainly don't see in my lifetime there being a single religion. There are numerous religions that are so solid now that I don't see any of them as going out of existence.
There was a travesty of John Lennon's famous Imagine song. You remember in John Lennon's song, one of the utopian things he looks forward to is no religion. And this was sung at, I think, an American football match by some famous singer who took it upon himself to substitute one religion. We know which religion that would have been.
Let's have a last gathered field of questions. Yes, this gentleman here, followed by this. Yeah.
There's archaeological evidence in things like Göbekli Tepe that shows that perhaps hunter-gatherer societies could band together to create complex temple systems. Do you think there's evidence to indicate that perhaps religion elevated hunter-gatherer societies in a way to see themselves as beyond the natural world in which they lived, to create to create more complex societies?
Okay, and another question. Yes.
That's on my maths, right? To have the fifth function of religion as promoting war or justifying. Within that context, St. Augustine's concept of just war, was that an evolution of the religion in the concept of religion, or was it imposed by the state at the time?
Okay, and one final question, Alex, at the back.
The definition of religion that Professor Diamond suggested had this neat separation between science and religion by excluding the natural, right? The supernatural had to be an essential feature of anything that is a religion. But I was wondering, from the point of view of the interaction of the society with what we think of as religion or not religion, what does that matter? What I am asking about is this. So, there was a question earlier about climate change, say, and what science versus religion have to say about this. And you could say, I'm a scientist, I understand this physics of climate change, and so I tell the population at large that there is climate change happening, and therefore they have to do the following things for the following scientific reasons. Their basis for then following me is essentially belief in the scientific principle, right? Pope Francis might tell them to do the same thing or the opposite thing for reasons that are to do with the supernatural, with the fact that God is looking after them or not looking after them, and so on. So, this notion that religion is declining in the modern society, and possibly and science is growing at the expense of it, does it actually matter from the point of view of how society draws benefit from embracing certain beliefs, that it really just has to embrace? And are we, the scientists, the new priesthood?
Okay, so temple building, the just war, science is the new priesthood.
Let me talk, perhaps as my final remark, the interesting questions about archaeology and monuments. Let's use these to ask ourselves, when in human evolution did evolution emerge? is there anything that we can learn from the archaeological record that would...
When you mean, did religion emerge?
Did religion,
Yes.
yeah, that's it. Yeah. When, is there anything we can learn from, infer from archaeology about when religion emerged? We can probably agree that chimpanzees today don't have religion, and the missing link between chimps and humans 6 million years ago didn't have religion. We can probably guess that Lucy and Homo habilis, we might guess, didn't have religion. But is there anything we can infer from the archaeological record about religion? And it seems to me that there are 3 things that may serve as proxies for religion. One is, how many of you here have been into the great Cro-Magnon caves like Chauvet or Lascaux?
I have a tie that illustrates it.
Bravo! All right. So if you've been in these French and Spanish Pleistocene caves, it is strongly suggestive that the motivation behind them was religion, because the caves certainly produce awe. To go into the caves, you would have needed in those days candlelight, and you see these pictures of animals. But the pictures of animals, they're very remarkable. The most remarkable picture that I recall at Lascaux is of an animal, possibly a horse, that was tilted upside down, tilted on its side on a cliff, where it was drawn in such a way as to suggest that the horse was hurtling over the cliff. And there are human figures and there are animal figures. The whole thing certainly stimulates awe. And I would take the cave paintings as a likely sign that the people who made the cave paintings were motivated by religion. Cave paintings in Europe go back to something like 40,000 years ago. I would take that to mean that some of the early behaviorally modern Homo sapiens had religion 40,000 years ago. Burial of the dead. Is burial of the dead evidence for religion? Well, we can't ask them why they did it, but most animals, every animal that we know does not bury the dead, and there's no evidence that Homo habilis buried the dead. Good evidence for burial of the dead is relatively recently. There's some debate about whether Neanderthals buried their dead, but they were Neanderthals until 32,000 years ago. That may be another hint that there was religion within the last 100,000 years. And then finally, when you mention monuments, so when you start to get monuments, Stonehenge and other stuff like that, monuments, based on what we see today, monuments are likely to mean religion. So the earliest monuments, there's monumental architecture, something like 10,000 years ago. I would take that to mean religion 10,000 years ago. I would take the cave paintings to mean religion 40,000 years ago. I would take burials possibly to mean religion earlier than that. What does it all mean? The emergence of behaviorally modern Homo sapiens is estimated something like 70,000 years ago, not 200,000 years ago. And therefore, behaviorally modern Homo sapiens I take to mean signs of a cognitive revolution. And that cognitive revolution, I think, had as a side consequence the emergence of religion.
Can I just say something about the scientist as priest?
This will be the last comment.
Okay. It's a good point because any one scientist has to take on trust what a scientist in a different field says. Certainly, as a biologist, I cannot understand modern physics. However, what science does have, which I think religious faith doesn't have, is a set of procedures in place that, although we don't know the details, we understand that something is going on, namely peer review is going on, repetition of experiments is going on, repetition in different parts of the world of the same experiment will produce the same result. The scientific method is geared up to combat self-deception, bias in favor of what one wants to find. We have these procedures in place which, in a way, we have to say we have faith in them, but it's a faith that can be justified by evidence, unlike religious faith, which by definition is justified by no evidence at all.
No evidence at all. The religious will claim religious experience. But I think with that,
They can claim whatever they like.
with that, with that, can I draw this evening to a close? It's been a fascinating conversation. Can we join us in thanking our speakers? Thank you.